Hi everyone, it's Professor Casey again. Welcome back. Today we're discussing Chapter 13 from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on westward expansion. Okay, we've discussed the different sectional areas of the United States, right, the Northeast, we've discussed the South, parts of the Midwest. And so now we can actually begin to discuss on the area that's gradually being colonized at this point in time, and especially beginning in the middle part of the 19th century. Okay, this is when really a lot more expansion westward begins to develop, okay, primarily because of mining exploits and, of course, because of the promise of new land. So by this point in time, the West really has a lot to offer for people living back east. Okay, we've already gone through a period of long-term economic instability back east. Okay, from the embargo acts during the Jeffersonian administration, all the way through the aftermath of the War of 1812, where the cotton industry is gradually just beginning to get on its feet, and even into the Jacksonian era. Okay, where we've already seen a lot of economic stability due to the Bank of the United States going under. Okay, so a lot of people are really looking for a stable way of life out west. And the Pacific Northwest in particular has a lot of stability to offer, especially where hunting and fishing is concerned. Okay, there are viable food sources out there, and also there's an active fur trade with the native tribes. Okay, and more so than that, if we go beyond the boundaries of the continental United States, right, the Pacific coast also links up with several other trading ports that connect to Asia as well. Okay, so there's a lot of promise for what could potentially happen on the West Coast over time. It could become very wealthy. And again, when it comes to economic improvement especially, that's really what drives most people to move out west, right? To strike it rich, or at least to become a little bit more successful than they have been. And again, some people do choose to move west for religious freedom, as we've already seen when it comes to groups like the Mormon Church. Okay, sometimes they're looking to obtain new converts, right? We still do have a little bit of a presence of Catholicism that is gradually trying to convert a few native tribes here and there, but still, it's largely Protestant movements now that are beginning to go out west. And the West is by no means empty either. This is another misconception of people at the time, anyway, is that this is an undeveloped, empty country. Okay, there are tons of Native American tribes that are still in existence west of the Mississippi River, and there's a lot of Hispanic residents too that have been pushed aside by white settlers along the way. Okay, remember, a lot of the area that is still to the southwest in particular is still the territory of New Spain. Okay, and this is the area that eventually ends up going into independent status, becomes part of Mexico, and then over time becomes another area of intrigue for the United States. And Southerners in particular who end up going west are really doing this to try to expand their own agricultural pursuits, okay, whether it's crops that they can grow for subsistence, or in many cases, when it comes to land speculators especially, looking to expand the cotton industry. And the South still maintains a large political edge because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Remember, this is still the thing that's been in existence since the country began. Okay, counting slaves as part of the population, but not treating them as 100% human beings. Remember, they're only considered 3/5 of a person, even though they're not even counted as humans. Okay? Nor are they counted as registered voters either. Now, in 1845, we get a Democratic Party propagandist named John O'Sullivan, who actually coins the term manifest destiny for the first time. Okay, we've already discussed this idea as something that people have already begun to think about, right? This somewhat misguided concept, right? That's an understatement, really, to describe how people moving west can actually claim the land in the name of the United States, claim it as God-fearing individuals, quote unquote, right? And really as a way of justifying everything that goes on in the aftermath of colonization, okay, or during the duration of it. And the U.S. tries its best to extend Christian capitalism, especially across the country and even beyond its shores, okay, especially once we get into the later part of the 19th century, once the U.S. finally reaches the other half of the country, right, once we actually get to the Pacific Ocean and have a transcontinental nation, we eventually begin to expand beyond our own borders. And again, this becomes a form of moral justification anytime expansion tactics are employed, and especially where racism is concerned. Remember the race myths that go along with Enlightenment era policies and stuff that goes along with biblical precedent as well is still used as justification for all this, okay, whether individuals agree with slavery or not. And from 1841 to 1867, it's estimated that around 350,000 men, women, and children end up trekking overland into the Pacific Northwest. Okay, this is the large-scale migration that we end up seeing during this time period. And not everybody goes all the way the full distance here either. They don't all settle at the end goal in the Pacific Northwest, right? And several hundreds of thousands of individuals actually end up stopping along the way. Okay, so that's why we get multiple settlements in Colorado, in Arkansas, in Texas, right, and several other areas along the way. And still, some of these areas are not part of U.S. territory either. Okay, Texas in particular at this point is being controlled by Mexico, which has gained an independent status since 1820. Okay, so we'll talk about that in the second half of this particular chapter. By 1845, though, about 5,000 people are estimated to have made the trip on an annual basis, okay? And these are large-scale groups, okay? This is not necessarily like Little House on the Prairie where you only see one covered wagon making the trip by itself, okay? Usually it's the equivalent of a small town getting up, packing several wagons in a row, and going out on an actual wagon train, okay? So you might have anywhere from a dozen or more wagons. And by 1848, the other big impetus for people moving west, again, this pairs very conveniently with economic expansion, is the gold rush. Okay? Gold is discovered in California. In many cases, when it first is discovered, too, in riverbeds, you could find gold the size of a softball, literally lying out in the open, and people could simply walk down a riverbed and pick up a small fortune along the way. Okay? So this, of course, draws tons and tons of people out west for the promise of this. Okay, and so in 1848 alone, you have a migration of about 30,000 people. Okay, and this extends into 1849 along what we now call the Oregon Trail. Okay, for those of you who remember the old 8-bit PC game from the 1980s and 1990s, this is exactly what we're talking about here. And as somewhat primitive as that video game seems to be to a modern audience, it's actually very accurate. Okay, all of the different struggles that you end up encountering along the way, wagon wheels breaking, animals going lame, people dying of dysentery and disease and all that kind of stuff, it's actually very, very accurate. And by 1850, travel is peaking at about 55,000 people in a single year. Okay, so this is a massive amount of people who are going all at the same time. Okay. Now, when it comes to the presence of Native Americans, okay, by 1840, the estimate here is over 325,000 Native Americans living across the Great Plains, all into California and in the Pacific Northwest. Okay, so these are tribes that have come into very brief contact, perhaps, with white settlers, but not quite as often as we see in the later part of the 19th century. And this is more than 200 nations in particular, okay? So it's not just 2 or 3 small tribes of natives. No, these are several hundreds of various cultures with their own languages, their own religions, their own system of governance, and their own methods for actually talking to whites, okay? In some cases, they end up actually going to war with anybody who comes into their territory, and some people actually end up, gaining, beneficial trade from one another, okay? But there are no actual literal lines drawn in the sand here, so no one really knows whose territory they're going into and whether these tribes are going to be friendly or not. And the Plains Indians in particular during this time period include the Arapaho, the Blackfoot, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, and the Sioux. Okay, the Sioux Nation is the one that comes into the most conflict with the federal government, especially once we get into the period known as the Indian Wars. This occurs in about the 15 years or so after the Civil War comes to an end. And some of them are farmers and some are nomadic hunters. Okay, this is still in the time period where Native Americans have just begun to use horses, probably for the last, maybe 100 years or so. Okay, so now their culture has changed and they're using horses to go on raids, to hunt buffalo, and they're pretty formidable, right? Not everybody who goes out west has more than maybe 1 or 2 horses in their possession. And the Pueblo nations in the southwest include the Acoma, the Hopi, the Laguna, the Taos, the Zia, and the Zuni. Okay, and these are groups that are actually farmers living in adobe villages out in the desert. And they tend to be rivals with the Apache and the Navajo, right? And the Apache and the Navajo are both much more warlike nomadic hunters. Okay, they actually get into they use guerrilla warfare. They get into pretty brutal conflicts with others along the way. Okay, and most of the Pueblo nations tend to be rather peaceful for the most part. And the Apache and the Navajo also have to deal with their own rivals, the Comanche. Okay, and the Comanche Nation at this point is arguably the most powerful native tribe in the Southwest. Okay, it's certainly the most wealthy because of the presence of horses. Okay, the Comanche control easily 75% of all of the horses living in the Southwest. And the Great Basin Indians, which are around the Colorado and Utah area, include the Paiutes and the Goshutes. Okay, and these individuals don't really do quite as well because we have a lot more settlers who are actually beginning to settle in these areas along the way in the Great Basin. Okay, and so they end up coming into more and more conflict with the whites who are there. Okay, so the whites and the natives in Colorado and Utah, all the way into California in some cases, end up not necessarily getting along. And there's a very small contingency that still remains in certain reservation areas even today. And most of the Great Basin hunter groups are actually hunter-gatherers, okay? So, again, they don't always try to settle down and actually plant farms or anything like that, because if nothing else, there's so much wild game in Colorado at this point, and in that particular region, okay? Up in the mountains, it's very difficult to find, of course, a flat space where you can actually farm anything. And, of course, it gets very cold up there quickly, so the planting season has to be extremely short. And of course, we also have the Pacific Northwest tribes, okay, the Nisqually, the Spokane, Yakama, Chinook, Klamath, and the Nez Perce, okay? And these groups are specifically hunters, okay? They have been for hundreds and hundreds of years by this point, and they utilize the natural resources and the climate to their own benefit, okay? They tend to do a lot of fishing, whale and sea hunting, and of course, they still have the entire Pacific Northwest forest right at their grasp, okay? So they do a lot of woodworking. They use the wood to build boats. They use it to construct totem poles. Okay, they have a very distinctive culture from the others. Now, when it comes to Mexico here, it's estimated at this point, and it's arguably so, that the whites are just as prejudiced against Hispanics as they are toward Native Americans. Okay, they view them as being culturally inferior rather than being intellectually inferior. Okay, because the Hispanics have struggled quite a bit in this case for a couple of centuries by now under Spanish rule. Okay, and most of the Hispanics living in the territory of what eventually becomes Mexico during this time period are actually the descendants of the mestizos, right? And if you recall from a few chapters back, right, the mestizos were the group that were native tribes people who intermarried with the Spanish and then had mixed ethnicity descendants. Okay, and so these groups have, constantly intermarried with one another down the line, and so they're still removed in many cases from native tribes, and they also feel alienated from Spanish culture as well. Okay? And Spanish colonization tends to be less successful in places like Arizona and in Texas than it does in Florida and New Mexico for some reason. Okay? In Texas, partly because of the presence of the Comanche. Okay? The Comanche actually run most of the territory all throughout central Texas, up into North Texas, and even parts of the Panhandle. Okay? And the Yuma, the Apache, and the Comanche, in particular, prevent the establishment of Spanish missions. Okay, they're actually fully against any more Spanish encroachment in this regard. And by 1807, the French forces under Napoleon end up occupying Spain, and they imprison the king. Okay, so this is what actually leads to the Spanish colonies suddenly being thrown into a state of confusion. Okay, and why all of these areas that end up eventually becoming Mexico fall back into independent status. Now, in one particular individual here, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, is a Creole priest who convinces the Indians and the Hispanics to work together and actually revolt against Spanish rule in Mexico. Okay, and in this first iteration, it actually ends up failing. Okay, it's a little bit too early for this to end up happening. But fast forward 13 years, and a second resistance actually ends up rising, and this actually causes the Spanish officials to completely flee Mexico by 1821. Okay, and this is the year that Mexico gains independent status. Now, of course, when the Americans see this happening, right, they know that Spain has left the region finally. This kind of goes along with what we talked about previously with the Monroe Doctrine, right, where they know if Spain tries to intervene and retake Mexico, then the United States is obligated to step in. Okay. And Americans look at this too and think, well, if this region is in a weakened state right now, if it doesn't really have a very effective government, this could be a possible opportunity for us to see some of the northern provinces of it, right? Namely, the areas that become the southwest states of the United States eventually, okay? Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, and even parts of Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, and Wyoming. And so now we get a mass wave of American settlers flooding into these regions to try to corner the market on the fur trade, try to establish American presence there, and gradually, in some cases very forcefully, edge the competition out of the way. Now, when it comes to the Oregon Trail, which we mentioned briefly earlier, by the early 19th centuries, the far Northwest Territories are divided into 3 distinct territories. Okay, and these territories haven't gained statehood status yet because there's not that many white settlers there yet. Okay, so we have the Nebraska Territory, the Washington Territory, and the Oregon Territory. And the Oregon country includes modern-day Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, parts of Montana, Wyoming, and British Columbia as well. In the Convention of 1818, Great Britain and the United States agreed to engage in joint occupation of this region. Okay, so it's still a contested region to a certain regard. And from the 1820s to 30s, the U.S. gradually sends mountain men into these regions, right? And these individuals completely abandon civilization altogether. They exist very primitively in the wilderness. They build log cabins with their own hands, and they get involved in the fur trade. Okay, and again, this is to try to establish an American presence without being directly tied as a government agent of some kind. And Oregon in particular becomes a target for settlement because of all the fertile soil, the heavy rainfall, and of course, like we said before, it has plenty of forest region. And in 1840, we have several immigrants who go along the Oregon Trail, beginning in St. Louis and eventually ending again in the Pacific Ocean. Okay? And if you ever play the computer game, you begin in St. Louis and take the exact same trail. From 1841 to 42, the first wagon train begins its own journey. Okay? And mass migration is, of course, underway by 1843. And again, these wagon trains are typically, again, they're small communities. They're several miles long. They involve families. In some cases, they even involve church congregations. Okay, so similar to what we've seen with the Mormon church kind of packing up and leaving en masse during this time period. Okay, kind of falls in line with that same time period and the same goals. And sometimes these are nicknamed prairie schooners because, again, the prairie itself seems like an endless sea of grass if you ever get out in the wide open flat areas of the country at this time where you won't see another human being for several days or even weeks. Okay? And so the wagons themselves with the white tarp over the top, right, the canvas material, looks like a ship almost sailing on this sea of grass. And the common image of Native Americans attacking these wagon trains is actually very much a stereotypical falsehood. Okay, it's usually the exact opposite. Okay, typically people who go out west in these wagon trains tend to actually misunderstand just how long they will go without finding any kind of natural resources, food, etc. Okay, and so when desperation kicks in, if they've been out in the prairie for several days or weeks without water, without a water source, a food source, a fuel source to burn fire or anything like that, they might end up attacking just about anybody who comes by, right, including Native Americans. Okay, so typically it's actually the people in the covered wagons attacking the natives rather than the other way around. And the trek itself is usually about a 6-month journey. Okay, so it takes a lot of organization, a lot of planning to make sure that you know where you're going and you know what you're doing. And there's plenty of difficulties along the way. Um, uh, if nothing else, disease itself probably kills more than anything else. Okay, primarily cholera in one case, because we have cholera typically lives in water that has gone stagnant. Okay, so if you have a barrel full of water, for example, and it stays that way too long, if insects get in it, if you have a rat that gets in it and drowns, for example, if it becomes tainted somehow, okay, then it becomes very easy to contract cholera. And cholera gradually causes you to become more and more dehydrated over time. Okay, your skin becomes pale and very doughy, and it doesn't have the elasticity to it anymore. Okay, and eventually you die of what essentially amounts to dehydration. And dysentery is the exact same thing in terms of dehydration. Okay, except dysentery ends up attacking your gastrointestinal system. Okay, and you essentially end up with diarrhea until you expire. Okay, it's a very horrible way to go. And again, water sources along the way are typically few and far between. Okay, and if you do happen to find a pond of some kind, there's a good chance that the water has been sitting there out in the sun for a while, and it has probably gone stagnant and contains disease of some kind. Okay, so you have to plan very, very carefully and know exactly what to carry and how much. And the most startling statistic I've ever come across with this is it's estimated that along the Oregon Trail, there's about one grave every 80 yards. Okay, there's that many people who died along the way, okay, simply from disease, if nothing else. And people attempt, to their credit here, right, to a certain extent, to try to get the same division of labor employed in the East out West. Okay, so they try to transplant the exact same social dynamics as much as they can, but they realize along the way very quickly that it's almost impossible to do that. The women try to cook, wash, sew, and monitor the children, right? They still are kind of involved in this cult of domesticity, even though there is not really a domicile to do it in. And the men tend to do most of the manual labor, right? Driving the wagons, tending the livestock, lifting things, hunting when necessary. And eventually it becomes a major realization and a wake-up call that it's almost impossible to continue this type of labor division, okay? That everybody has to pitch in and do the exact same thing in order for everyone to survive. Okay, so women end up gathering buffalo dung for fuel because there's very few trees, right? There's almost nothing to burn, okay, for fuel. They have to help drive wagons, help pull wagon wheels out of the mud, construct makeshift bridges to get across a river if possible, pitch tents, right? They have to start engaging in a lot of the actual manual labor that men do, okay? And the women who come from the South who are part of kind of this small farmer contingency might have already been somewhat familiar with this, right? If everyone in the family has been working together on the farm from a young age, then it typically goes a little bit smoother, okay? But if they're not used to this type of labor, there's enough of a pushback to where it ends up causing problems. And naturally, family relations become heavily strained over time too, okay? If the only people you are seeing for 6 months is your own family or your own community, you get very tired of them quickly, okay? And unsurprisingly, divorce rates end up soaring once people actually do reach the West. Now, the most infamous example of what not to do when it comes to going out west during this period concerns a group known as the Donner Party, okay? Now, in 1846, in April, a man named George Donner leads his family, including 74 other settlers and 23 wagons, on the Oregon Trail. Okay, and he makes several mistakes along the way here. Okay, again, this acts as a perfect template of how not to do this. For one thing, he starts very, very late in the year. Okay, starting in April. Okay, you have 6 months to get there, and by the time that you reach the last leg of your journey, right, winter is already beginning to settle in. Okay? He ends up overloading the wagons. They carry way too much. Okay, and the wagons are strained, the wheels break, the animals get lame along the way. And the stuff that they do bring is not stuff that they need. Okay, so they don't bring the right kind of food, they don't bring enough water, they don't bring enough winter clothing, and again, they don't have anybody who's extremely experienced. And so the Donners actually end up getting lost in the Wasatch Range and lose 3 weeks of progress. Right, this is the first major misstep. Okay, by September, snow actually begins to fall. Okay? And eventually they descend into the desert of the Great Salt Lake, but they end up losing over 100 oxen and wagons in the process. Okay, so this is another major pitfall here. And if they had decided to stay there and not continue, then things might have gone a little bit better. Okay. Unfortunately, they do continue, though, and they get trapped by a 2-week-long blizzard in the Truckee Pass in eastern California. Okay. And by the end of December, there's only enough food to last through the end of the month. Okay, half of the pioneers in this particular party, by the way, are children. 17 of the strongest individuals of the group end up continuing and agree that they're going to send a search party to come back and help everyone. 2 of them turn back, and 8 of them end up dying of starvation. Now, things take a very brutal turn here because one settler named Billy Graves urges his daughters to eat his body after his death, okay, because he's already either sick or injured, I forget which, and knows that his days are numbered. 2 more settlers end up being cannibalized after they die, and out of the 17 who end up continuing on, only 7 of them end up surviving. Okay, and these are the survivors who have committed cannibalism, who actually end up going all the way, and then having to relate their story and send other people back to help. Now, when the search party finally does manage to get back, okay, they discover that all of the livestock has been slaughtered. Okay, 2 Indian guides have been killed and cannibalized along the way. And when the rescue team does finally arrive at the original encampment 2 months later, 47 members of the Donner Party, the 47 who remain, kill and eat 13 people total. Okay, so this is an extremely horrific example of desperation, okay, and what can actually happen. And there are actually eyewitness accounts of what people, the people, the members of the search party who actually discovered the cabins, young children who have actually consumed parts of their parents. Some really, really nightmarish instances here. So there's plenty that you can read about out there on the internet if you have a strong stomach. But it's a very, very horrific episode. And George Donner and his wife elect that they are going to stay behind and die. Right? He feels like he has completely failed his party, and this seems to be the only way that he can really save face. Next thing we'll talk about quickly here is the settlement of California, which again is becoming more and more of a goal for people over time, especially once we get into the middle part of the 19th century. In 1769, Spain decides it's going to settle the Pacific coast to try to prevent Russia from gaining more territory. And because Russia has a little bit of territory along the upper regions near Oregon into Washington and even parts of Alaska. Okay, Alaska doesn't actually become a state until we get into the 1950s. Now, we talked about presidios already, right? These are, Spanish government installations that are typically military forts of some kind, right? These are constructed at San Diego and at Monterey. And if you go to San Diego in particular today, you can still see some of the remnants of one of these. The Franciscan friars who end up settling the region are led by Junipero Serra, who you see here, and they establish a Catholic mission there in San Diego. You can actually find a large statue of him there on the coast there by the lighthouse. And the California missions tend to be much larger, they're better funded, and they last a lot longer. Okay, again, they're not as neglected as the ones out in the desert. And the Spanish Catholic missions in California end up controlling the large portion of the Indians who are living along the Pacific coast. Okay, so there's not very much freedom for native tribes living in the region. They tend to fall under the auspices of Spain. And they're very complex, these missions, okay? They contain churches, villages, fortresses, which we've already talked about, individual homes and schools, shops, farms, and even Spanish outposts, out in the more remote regions, okay? So these are much more well-developed than what we've seen in places like New Mexico. And still, the same precedent remains that Native Americans provide most of the labor, okay? And the Franciscan friars tend to be a little bit more brutal when it comes to, well, I take that back. The Franciscans are not as overbearing as the Dominican friars are. Okay? The Dominicans are the ones who tend to be a little bit more brutal in their treatment of the natives. Franciscans believe that this is something morally enriching. Okay? That this is toiling out in the heat is going to help save the souls of these individuals. Okay, they're misguided at best. And the typical daily routine is individuals rise every morning before dark, they enter into prayer until the sun rises, and then they go and work out in the fields until dusk. And the men, again, tend to work in the fields, sometimes in specialized skill sets if there are facilities for it. They become blacksmiths, carpenters, leather workers, etc. And again, the women are still pigeonholed into this kind of domestic sphere, right? They tend to handle washing, being a laundress, a seamstress, that sort of thing. And everyone is expected to work in the fields during the harvest season. So this sounds very, very similar to what you would hear in a plantation situation in the South. And the Indians are paid with food, with a little bit of clothing, housing, and again, religious instruction, whether they want it or not. And the numbers that live out west during this period end up dropping considerably over time, in large part because of disease, but also in part because of abuse, okay, physical, sexual, etc. So from 1769 until 1821, the native population drops from 72,000 to roughly 18,000. Okay, so this is a dramatic drop in numbers. And once the Mexican independence ends up occurring, right, most of the Spanish officials end up fleeing the country, the money dries up, and the missions end up falling into disuse. Okay, and so now the individuals who end up taking over are individuals known as caballeros or rancheros, okay, and they end up lording over the 6,000 odd Mexicans who still live in the regions, as well as the Indians themselves who end up surviving. Okay, so it's kind of a martial law type situation, right, where these individuals end up taking over the missions and kind of reintroducing the feudal system to a certain regard. And so over the course of the next 20 or so years, the Californios, who is the name given to the Hispanics living in the region, end up launching 10 different revolts against the Mexican governors, trying to push them out of the region. The last individual we'll talk about in this first half here is an individual named John Charles Frémont. Okay? In the 1840s, he is the one who begins to champion the settlement and exploration of Mexican California. Okay? And again, he is an American. Okay, so he is one of the first ones to say, if California really has all this to offer, right? This is still in the period right before the gold rush occurs. If we can take control of this region, right, then it will give us an actual anchor point between the East Coast and the West Coast. 1838, he's commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Topographical Corps. These are individuals who actually are map makers. Okay, so he is tasked with actually going out west and mapping the region. Okay, and he's a very excellent frontiersman. Okay, he's a map maker, a surveyor. He knows woodcraft, which means he knows how to track animals. He knows how to, build his own campfires. He knows how to take care of himself in the wilderness. Okay, and he's also very gifted when it comes to zoology, geology, botany, ornithology, the study of birds. Right, so he's a naturalist in many ways. And by 1842, he sets out to map the Oregon Trail in 5 months and collect specimens along the way. So he's kind of like a one-man Lewis and Clark. And his expeditions end up being published in these little excerpts, kind of like Lewis and Clark's do, in several national newspapers, and he gets a lot of publicity for this, right? He becomes kind of a national celebrity, okay? And he's given the nickname the Pathfinder for his exploits. Now, in August of 1845, he launches a quote-unquote military expedition. Okay, he takes 62 armed men, right, soldiers, sailors, a few scientists, frontiersmen, and hunters to go along with him. Okay, they head south of the Sierra Nevada mountains in December and into Mexican-controlled California. And in January, he's instructed by the president at the time to encourage this spontaneous uprising to take control of California. Okay, so he's trying to launch some kind of a mutiny among the Americans who live there to take control of the state. And Frémont ends up leaving the province under orders from Mexico to do so. Okay, he resigns from the army and decides to go into business as a private citizen for himself. So this is something that he very narrowly escapes being arrested and potentially executed for. And in June of 1846, Americans managed to capture Sonoma and proclaim the Republic of California for the first time. So from this point on, now we'll start to look a little bit more at the advent of the Mexican-American War. Okay? See you guys next time.